Hello and welcome to Movie Talk. My name is James and I'm joined by Molly,
Hi.
Rohan,
Hi.
And Paul.
Hello.
This week we screened Ken Loach's I, Daniel Blake, a story of a working man's struggle against the bureaucratic benefit system. Daniel is caught in a catch-22 situation which sees him seeking work to qualify for job seekers allowance, even though his doctors have told him he is not fit for work following a heart attack. Daniel becomes increasingly embittered with the state while he seeks to help a single mother and her two children, who are also on the edge of down and out. Much has been spoken of Ken Loach's accolades as a kitchen sink director, makes films about working people for working people, but are his films oversimplifying and extending a populist narrative of the people versus the state? Paul, what do you think?
I think it's a complex question, but it's austerity has been such a big thing in the last decade, and talk in the media around the benefit system and all this. That seeing something like this, supposedly made from the working class perspective, is obviously a pretty important thing to explore, and I felt like it did it pretty well. But then, it's a complicated one because is Ken Loach. I don't know Ken Loach's background, but at least this point he's a fairly successful filmmaker. So is how much does he know? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and he's got this kind of. To be fair, what adds to the complexity, he's got this quite, significant track record in documenting working class life and telling, and really since the '60s, he's had a remarkably long career. As part of a kind of British New Wave, as it was called, as it was called, kind of dubbed. He's been kind of his trademark are these kind of socially conscious, incredibly critical stories which really try and give a voice and present with a kind of with an attempt at kind of objective kind of humanity and dignity and give those sort of and really use film as a platform. I think he's really got that, which I think in some ways looks maybe a little bit dated and a little bit ideological because he is part of that kind of more socialist old guard.
I think by their nature they have to be oversimplified to have an effect. You can really unravel all the complexities of it to have a story that has an effect on you.
Soviet cinema has a similar. I'm not comparing here. Oh, look, he's left wing and he's definitely a communist, but I think there's an aspect of the way he they used very upfront, explicit, kind of simple kind of oppositions and concepts. They to use film as a platform for their own agendas and for their own beliefs. And although Loach is certainly no agitprop director, I think he's using the medium in a particularly in a similar way. It's functional. I think that's me. It's functional, and the characters within it speak and the people who's speaking it there. It's not like they're kind of artificial, because I think I've been speaking earlier that he does try to present society in a very conceivable, accurate way, but as I said, dialogue.
What do you mean? Did you say he does present?
Well, I was speaking to Molly. Molly was saying about the accents are all kind of correct, being as a resident of Newcastle.
It did feel like Newcastle.
Yeah, it wasn't like
the representative for Newcastle.
Yeah, and I think, but at the end of the day, I think character and characterization and dialogue kind of ultimately serve a purpose.
I think Ken Loach is, particularly in I, Daniel Blake, is very upfront and unapologetic about he's making a polemical film with a purpose, and I think that it does achieve that purpose. Really, so just think of, so obviously it was, like you asked earlier, it could be seen as populist, but I think in a way that helps its message. So it was very widely watched, but and
I guess
made an impact.
I do agree with you that it's for a purpose, but I don't necessarily think by oversimplifying such complex structures that have it's not just a matter of the state wants to be cruel and punish people for being out of work, but that that's kind of what it's implying. There was a complexity behind it. And if you look, what has really changed has following this, like
That's true.
the only thing that's happened really is like they're trying to roll out universal credit,
which is
even cooler. Like,
well, to be fair, I think Loach was anticipating, because universal credit had been announced at the same time, and it's taken years to roll out. But the cruelty of the benefit system has been, there are news stories coming in left, right, and centre. I think his portrayal of the benefit system, although heightened for dramatic purposes, i.e., and I don't think I feel it'd be fairly, if you were trying to think of truth, if you were trying to look at it as truth to experience or truth to life in a really like kind of like exact way, then the presentation of the benefits office could be seen as unfair. But the idea is it's supposed to be a cross section of the system as a whole and the way it treats people. And you see stories all the time in the papers about
benefit scroungers. And
the demonisation of it's off the back of a kind of systematic demonisation of working class people over the last like 20 years, and post Thatcher really, and the way the benefit system is geared up to exclude and effective.
Well, it is effectively like a form of punishment, but I do think this film does portray the emotions of. It's more of like the emotional complexity of being in that situation rather than the like political complexity.
Yeah.
Though it's like the story functions to like really, like you're saying, explore the characters and like what people like feel going through this. Rather,
But I think you make a good point there, because I think maybe there could be more could be said about. Like more could be said like maybe about the internal pressures within the bureaucracy, and maybe the people within it feel are pressured by
because they also might feel helpless.
Yeah, exactly. They're trapped within that structure, and maybe that's what that is it? I think is it Anne or the name of one of the
sympathetic
nice benefits officer,
and
maybe she represents that. But then again, the opposition between her and her more kind of callous colleagues is again very stark.
Yeah.
So I can definitely see where it might fall down, and they kind of the manager is almost a kind of comedic grotesque exaggeration in places
like
the
baddies essentially, aren't they?
This is disgusting.
Bald big bad man.
Yeah.
It is in touch, but it's that difficulty in trying to represent, as you said, a cross section of. It's trying to represent the benefit system as a whole in a few number of characters, so it's not necessarily inaccurate, but can seem cartoonish when it's distilled down into one manager has to represent all of the benefits managers essentially, and all of the rubbish there.
And at that point, it feels very much like old school proper political kind of cinema. Really, that's where it reminds me of agitprop in places, because you have characters kind of acting symbolically. Kind of acting. They're not really they're not acting as real people. I know this sounds like a weird. It's hard to necessarily delineate, but they're acting as representations of
groups
of ethics rather than people and characters in themselves. Thus, their inhumanity is polarized. Is it polarized against Daniel Blake's and the certain characters converse humanity, and that's where I suppose that very big opposition takes place.
I think that's an interesting point, but I also, because Molly, you were telling me someone who at the screening was talking about how they found it actually quite patronising, this representation of working class people, and they also didn't like the fact that, well, this is not really new, but the charge that the people watching Ken Loach's films are guilty middle class people.
Yeah.
What do we think of that?
Yeah, I found it really interesting. So I was talking to someone from, so he's from the place where Kes was shot and set, and it was clear that he had some quite justifiable issues with Loach. Just he seemed to he was saying how it seemed to him like a sort of patronising middle class sort of vision of the noble poor, and it's grim up north, and that it's not actually doing much to further things. It's just for other middle class people to watch and go, oh no, that's sad. So
liberal hand wringing.
Yeah. And I completely see his point. But
that being said, is anyone interested in seeing his new film about the gig economy?
I'm curious about
Yes,
that.
I
I'd
am.
like to see that.
I mean, that comes out.
I mean, it does
this week.
seem so. From what I've seen of the trailer, it seems like an extension of
Yeah,
following on almost from I, Daniel Blake, as in like.
it's addressing a different wing. Like he's addressing the benefit system in Iron Man Rogue, and then he's also addressing the tenuous and employment, types and structures which have come out of the wake of the financial crash.
I think that I do like Ken Loach, but I do feel like he's grounded in the 1960s ideas of also. I also find certain it's like ideas of family. He's like he has got a strong sense of family in all his films, like the family versus the world, like the state in a way.
And I think that's maybe him showing his age a little bit, because I think that is interesting, because I did think in his representations of these characters and the whole noble poor thing, that's I think where he's showing his age, because although he's got a diverse cast, the accent is a
working class actors, I think.
Yeah, there's working class actors, but then there's something about there's just something feels a bit like it's almost a bit like it still feels like a 1970s film, maybe because of the presentation of the presentation of working class people in general is kind of it feels more lodged in a era when I think this might just be his own Loach. This is very much what Loach is trying to say, like, an era when the sort of working class people had self-respect and they were noble and that kind of thing, and that's what he's trying to. That's kind of the era he comes from, and you had strong union representation. You had solid communities, lots of families. That's how he saw working that's what he thinks we've lost. I think.
I mean, it will be interesting to see how, because I do feel like in that sense he is dated, because politics has become, or just society, so individualized. So is there really a working class identity anymore? Is it really rooted in something that strong? Obviously people still say they're working class, but what does that really mean anymore? Does that group still exist?
That's the thing.
Yeah.
He doesn't address decentralization, that kind of that subtle shift in values and the fragmentation of values, because if you notice, everyone has a very similar value system.
There's a sense of all being in it together,
which is just that tiny bit inaccurate. And I think that's
especially
what
with
sticks.
the when the homeless man, or I'm not sure, was cheering I, Daniel Blake.
Gets cheered on by a stranger.
I think that represents what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
It would be fascinating to see him do a film that directly tries to take on that kind of, the idea of the destruction of working class solidarity and so on. Margaret Thatcher, there's that famous quote where she says, there's no such thing as society.
I do think his films are important, but I feel like it needs a younger, fresh look at these issues, kind of, because he is an old man now.
Yeah.
I
mean, not to say that
I'm not saying
being an old man means that.
No, but it's I thought you kind of you're rooted and you're nostalgic for your past, and I'm sure Ken Loach is
so
making these films with 1960s, 70s in mind, consciously or unconsciously.
Well, I suppose as we get to the what are our closing comments on the film? Exactly.
Yeah, I think while it's not particularly subtle or nuanced, I don't think it's trying to be that. So it could be accused of being, heavy-handed or populist, but ultimately I think it's quite a very humane film that's very angry about this, this horrible situation, and I think that
which does deserve to
it
be
carries
put on
it.
it.
I think ultimately that carries it through.
It is a very powerful film, I think.
So, in this week's feature section, Auteurs versus Avengers, we'll be discussing the recent furore caused by the auteurs Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Ken Loach, who have all recently publicly condemned Marvel. So, Francis Ford Coppola described Marvel films as despicable and saying that they weren't cinema. How do people feel about that? Do you think he's justified, or is he going a bit far?
I disagree with him. They are cinema.
Yes.
I don't think they're very good. I don't enjoy them, but I think he's going too far to call them despicable.
Yeah.
I think that the trouble is, I mean, just on a really broad perspective, you get these kind of filmmaking auteur heavyweights making a very obvious kind of elitist point, and and what they do, they kind of, it doesn't help the situation. It doesn't shed any light on what the kind of Marvel franchise is doing. It just kind of I mean, I know some of it has, you know, there are artistic merits. Some of it's, you know, some are quite well made, and there's some interesting issues explored. I'm aware of that. That being a potentially an angle to go down. I'm not saying they're high art or anything, but it's just this insistence on binary kind of oppositions between high and low culture, between mass market and the kind of, you know, there isn't. I mean, without sounding too much like Tony Blair's like bastard child, the third way hasn't really been given enough attention with this in this sort of argument. I mean, what do others think about this?
I just think it's needlessly exclusionary. It's like, if you're gonna make that argument, then isn't like every kind of broy comedy also no longer cinema or something? Just because it's not trying to do something with like deep human experience and emotions doesn't mean it's not cinema. It's a different kind of cinema, sure, but like it's not trying to be that, and cinema can be lots of different things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that saying this isn't cinema or this isn't art is, you know, it is going too far and it's exclusionary. I don't think something has to be good to be cinema, but I do see so Ken Loach, another of these, you know, big people who've come forward to talk about Marvel, has described Marvel superhero films as commodities like hamburgers. So
well, I suppose that's a very obvious comment to be made from. I mean, maybe this is Loach showing his age again, because you know, of course, hamburgers are American and they're you know they
mass produced.
They're mass produced, and you know, and
soulless.
Soulless. But it's just but then again, it's the most obvious trope. I mean, maybe this is a redundant. I don't know what avenue I'm going down, but like, what I'm trying to say is that isn't there anything more to say?
Yeah.
No,
Can't there be anything else to say about this?
I mean, I see how these auteurs seem to be threatened by the idea that all these Marvel, you know, superhero blockbusters are dominating the market, and you know they seem to think that they're kind of suffocating other perhaps more independent avenues of filmmaking, and you know they are right in a way. So like, according to The Guardian, Avengers Endgame was the highest grossing film in history with $2.8 billion, and in the top 30 highest grossing films, nine of them are Marvel films. So that's pretty crazy. Like, you can see why where these concerns are coming from. Do you think that they're a threat to independent filmmaking?
I think they're kind of hypocritical, because what they're implying is they don't see their films as products as well. They're kind of only suggesting that Marvel, they're trying to make money from their films, but they're annoyed because they're being priced out because their films don't make as much money. So Martin Scorsese is being forced to go to Netflix and getting a limited cinema release, where these big Marvel films get like a huge cinema release.
If anything, in the logic of today's contemporary kind of like aesthetic culture, that will just increase his artistic credentials more if it's getting a limited Netflix release.
It's creating people like us who don't like Marvel, so we can
it defines our existence.
Which can be.
I mean, to the film seminar, I had a film seminar very much on Easy Rider, which was very much about this whole issue of the kind of feedback loop between the mainstream and the counterculture. You can only, if you're going to destroy capitalism, or destroying capitalism basically requires you to be part of it. It digests itself. So any countercultural kind of movements rely on it kind of inversely. I know this is, you know, independent cinema down this far down the line isn't necessarily a countercultural, like that isn't really the point of what we're trying to say. But like, I think that if anything, independent cinema is given way more kind of I think we're in a, I don't know what you guys would think of this, but I think we're in it's in a great position these days. It's actually, if anything, there's way more opportunity, there's way more ability to get yourself out there and create platforms. Again, it's hard to get obviously it's always hard to get noticed, but at least you can get yourself a small form of distribution.
I agree. It's much easier to put. You can put films on YouTube, though they might not get. Not many people might not see them. It's still democratizing of filmmaking in a way.
And there's a lot of independent films that even now are going, like, they're having their small limited cinema release, but they're also already available to stream or rent on streaming services and so on, which is giving it a wider platform. And you know, to come back around slightly to the idea of, is it suffocating those kind of films or pushing them out the market? It's like, some of the best films I've ever seen are independent releases I saw in the last 3 years. You know, there doesn't seem to be a lack of good independent cinema.
Yeah.
Also, I think, could you say in a way a lot of what, like, great filmmaking is also on TV now? So like Breaking Bad.
Well, that's the thing. Don't you feel that what Loach and Scorsese etc. have kind of they're displaying a very cinema centric kind of anxiety, because their means of distribution is something they're whinging about. Their grievances are mainly centered around the fact that the Marvel universe is getting the major cinema stage on the big screen.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not really all about the big screen anymore.
No.
Obviously, cinema is still very special, and I still think it should be. I still think it should have definitely should have a future, and I understand the importance of showing independent cinema films in cinema. But at the same time, you've got to address that just because it isn't showed in a cinema, it isn't as much of a threat to its existence anymore than it used to be.
Yeah.
And the amount of premieres on Netflix, which obviously, and we just talked about this, streaming services and platforms. It's if anything, it's harder to navigate now. The new issue is of proliferation rather than deprivation. If anything, there's too much of it.
Yeah.
I do agree about I do agree that I don't really see Avengers and all that as a threat to independent or so-called like high art cinema, but I get a concern more from the point of view of what's happening to mainstream cinema. Like Disney, they own Marvel, they own obviously, Disney children's films and Star Wars. I just don't like, I feel like this monopolization of the mainstream cinema, it just feels like all the offerings from mainstream cinema are from the same few franchises or companies.
Don't you think that's kind of hypocritical? Because people always hawk back to like the golden age, the 1950s studio system.
Yeah.
I mean, it's similar to that.
No. I don't think that this is an issue of like nostalgic, back in the good old days. I think we've been here before with monopolization and...
Well, it's vertical integration, isn't it?
Yeah. And I don't know, I don't think it's a good direction to be going in, really. Like, do we really want to go back to the days of, the same film? I mean, golden age of Hollywood, great stuff, but so much of it was just, mass-produced, like the fact that all those musicals which were carbon copies of each other, very few of them, we've kind of erased how much of it was
trash.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was actually it was Pulp Fiction.
Pulp Fiction.
So what do you
I'm
think the legacy of Marvel will be then? Do you think these films, say in 50 years, we'll be talking like Iron Man, or Iron Man, Iron Man, or Black Panther as classics?
I think they've been
the same as Star Wars, I guess.
Yeah,
like our parents
they're
about Star
culturally
Wars.
significant.
Yeah, they've been iconic films for a whole generation of people.
Yeah.
I've grown up with them, and they've gotten a lot of people into cinema. I think there's a lot of people who have really gotten into film as a concept.
I don't think that's true.
No, you don't.
I think
I think
there's
it's
got a
a
lot of
niche
people
of
into
its
Marvel.
own, isn't it? Yeah, like I think people, as far as I can tell, getting into Marvel means you get into superhero and comic book and superhero TV culture rather than it seems to me like it doesn't. It's so insular. It doesn't really transfer into other. It doesn't even transfer into other types of mainstream cinema. Like
I think it potentially gets people.
It's so limiting.
It potentially gets people into the idea. Perhaps this is a better way of saying it. Of taking. Of like really being not just watching a film and dismissing it, but like really analysing film, or like maybe not to a great extent, but people have these discussions about their favorite Marvel films and what they liked about them and things
Well,
like that. People who might not necessarily.
But yeah, you've got
so
James
deep.
Bond, you've got the westerns. You know, they're these epochs of kind of effectively less consciously realised, but they're kind of cinematic. These cinematic universes have kind of existed for quite a while, and this is just another period of them. I keep seeing history repeating itself in many ways because we've had because again Netflix, the state of Netflix now and a lot of streaming services is kind of similar to the studios, the height of the studio of classical Hollywood, when you've got like a few kind of flagship AAA kind of shows that people really want to see, critically acclaimed, incredibly popular, like Breaking Bad and stuff like that. But and then you've got some questionable stuff, and then you've got some good stuff hiding in there, and then you've got loads and loads of kind of ten a penny crime dramas and kind of sagas and series. It's the same thing. It's just if anything more infinite.
Yeah, it's so formalized and centralized, and I think that's what. Maybe I'm just being an old nostalgic fogey, but yeah, I don't like how just it's so like. And I'm not naive enough to think that all these other like James Bond or like westerns aren't also like precision engineered for sort of profit. Obviously that's just how Hollywood works, but it's just such a clever product, like designed to. I think this whole cinematic universe to me seems like such a cynical exercise in
franchising.
Franchising. It's
Because
so formal and
it's interesting to see how
structured.
they've almost tried to respond to that themselves by doing things like hiring these niche filmmakers like Taika Waititi, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Well,
and so on.
And then that harks back to the kind of 1920s kind of European, especially German emigre, who kind of made it big in Hollywood, and loads of those were experimental film directors. People like Murnau, and who did Nosferatu. I forgot who did The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Fritz Lang.
Yeah, they all. I think that at least one of them made it to Hollywood. Maybe Murnau. I think Murnau died.
I think Fritz Lang.
Yeah,
did.
Fritz Lang did. Yeah.
I mean, I do understand why you're calling it like a cynical production to like suck people in and to take the rise in. But I do think fundamentally it's jealousy, because they're jealous. They're jealous of the interaction Avengers films get, which they want. They see their films as more important than Marvel films because they're politically astute or like aware.
Yes,
so
there is
they're
a
jealous of
snobbishness
why can't my films have that kind of interaction with fans endlessly talking about it? But I think that's never been the case and never will be the case, because people prefer to be entertained and watching Daniel Blake and seeing how bleak the world is.
Yeah.
But can't they be entertained in at least a more varied way? Like what other mainstream... I don't know, maybe it's always been like this, but it feels like superhero films is like the only massive mainstream genre. Can't we have superhero films and rom-coms and thrillers?
But there will always be like
a Marvel...
on a more equal footing, at least, rather than just one genre and one company dominating everything.
But this will end, and like the company, well,
will it, or will it just
change.
be replaced by another company that also
Not
just
necessarily
monopolises
making
the whole
superhero
thing?
films, but there'll always be like a mainstream.
Yeah.
I suppose it'd
But
be
can't
interesting
there
to
be
see
more
an
of a range?
avant-garde. It'd be interesting to see an avant-garde
Of genre, at least.
kind of like superhero film.
I'm sure
So
it will
Logan,
come.
Is-
have you seen Logan? Has anyone seen Logan?
No,
Yeah,
but I remember
yeah.
hearing that was
So
a bit different.
Logan is genuinely like one of the better. It's up on my list for like top films of the last decade. It's pretty damn good. Like it's this.
Could you expand more on that?
It's been a little while since I've seen it now,
Is
but
it
like
old Wolverine?
yeah, it's old Wolverine, and it very much gets into this idea of like, as the character's aging and dying, and he's in this like it's set in the near future in a kind of like capitalist nightmare. I mean, a worse one than the one we live in. But and like him outliving his friends, and his friends have all died, and so on, and like he's confronting his own mortality, and there's this stuff around him taking care of this young child, and having to kind of confront his mortality and all this kind of thing, and it works so well because you've had so many years of Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine. And it works almost on this meta level as well, of people saying goodbye to Hugh Jackman as playing Wolverine. And it's a fascinating film, I think, genuinely. Because it's such a quiet film. There's not a lot of big action sequences in it.
I forgot about Logan, actually. It is quite a good film.
Yeah.
But I guess you could also say, like, Black Panther kind of engaged with social issues.
Mm.
Well, a lot of people thought it did.
Yeah, the more interesting ones because I'm not gonna.
But
I know I've just been, whining about them, but I don't think Marvel is completely without value.
Sure.
When they, like you mentioned that Taika Waititi one, I think Thor 2, 3, whatever it was.
Thor 3, yeah.
Yeah, when they do decide to do something a bit different within the mold, they can be all
well,
right.
you could look at it really cynically and say they're just looking for legitimacy, like
I'm sure,
because they are like they're going for awards, like also like with Joker as well.
Yeah,
they want legitimacy to kind of like.
Yeah.
I guess you could maybe like to secure their legacy or like their, and then so Marvel film or superhero films they are trying to say something. But.
And now we enter the section of the pod, the last section of the podcast dedicated to the week's reading. So last week, James set Molly and I Ali Fear Eats the Soul, Raina Werner Fassbinder's 1974 kind of drama about the relationship between an Algerian immigrant and an older German woman, and it's a very poignant and kind of meditation on race relations, ageism, and the kind of how society molds a relationship. So I mean,
yeah. What did you think? Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting because I really liked the kind of the sincerity that it took, even at points when I felt the representation of Ali veered into slightly more, I mean, to use the big buzzword, problematic territory. I think for example, but then I've been talking about this. We were talking about this probably earlier. There's this sort of curious intersection between the kind of between the directorial style, which is very kind of, it's slow, the dialogue's methodical, the action is very segmented, deliberately, almost to kind of to demonstrate. It feels like it feels very like a play in places, like the scenes in the bar, for example.
Like portraits. Kind
Yeah.
Of a scene.
Yeah, definitely.
Lots of shots of people through doorways at a long distance. Loads of them.
So I swear Hitler's favourite restaurant.
Oh yeah.
With
But
that shot through it. Yeah.
yeah, but I noticed like I should have been counting, but it that was like a nice motif of like people sort of isolated and small.
Oh, the internal
in a doorway.
framing. The internal framing.
That internal framing.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Like it really constricts it, and the world is so kind of like cold and indifferent, and and haunt and sort of empty. That's what it's. There's a real There's a real sense of space of constricted space, but also being surrounded by a kind of a landscape of insecurity.
I think because that's why I quite like it, because it feels like he's trying to like bring back like the kind of performance of like characters and like stereotypes to get like to like just the basis of like human interaction. I think that's what he's trying to do. Maybe
That
it's problematic with Ali.
Yeah.
Kind of just like also how other people view him, and it's like it's very rigid and there's not like expression. There's not much movement like you're saying.
No, he's not a fleshed out.
But I'm not. Yeah, I'm
character
not sure
in
how I
his own
feel.
right.
If, like, is that problematic? I don't know. It's kind of on the line.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah, because you get this moment. I think, but then there's definitely an awareness of it, because watching the last like part of it. There's a bit where the relationship between kind of Emmy and Ali becomes a little sours a little, and you can see her. Is it kind of invoking or resorting to some social prejudices?
At which point?
Well, kind of the bit where she sort of, I guess, well, social prejudices or imposing kind of sort of national idea, imposing kind of idea, becoming less accepting in these small moments. Like I think, when the whole thing, like she doesn't want to make couscous,
yeah,
and then that causes a fraction.
And thought the moment when that particularly like drove it home to me was when some of her sort of cleaning lady friends come round.
That's what I was going to
these
say.
like
Yeah.
middle-aged white women circling this like, young muscular black man and just sort of prodding his muscles.
Well, they're
It was,
objectifying
like,
him loads.
But it was also like horribly reminiscent of like a slave market almost. Like it was quite
Oh, look at-
uncomfortable.
Oh, doesn't it remind you a little bit in that scene of Get Out?
Yeah.
And then
yeah,
when
sort
you've
of-
got that
yeah.
when you've got like when you've got it, that's the thing. It does remind me of Get Out now, and you've got the kind of what's his name, the converted kind of like the robotite, the kind of brainwashed kind of
'Cause
black
he
guy
sort
who's
of
dressed up
raises
in
his
a
arms
Stetson
to
hat.
flex, doesn't he? Just
Yeah.
like automatically.
And then you've got an old woman who's like, "Oh, I've got my new kind of black boy with me."
Yeah,
Section. But
Mm.
then again,
It's
maybe
uncomfortable.
Fassbinder's trying to make the same point.
I
think so.
Yeah, I think the key scene in the film for me is in Hitler's previous favorite cafe when they are framed through the doorway. And
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
that's how they're viewed, and it's kind of
Yeah.
end up with the historical context of Germany and the Second
Yeah.
World War and prejudice.
Yeah.
I think
It's a really nice scene.
And there's also another bit which I really liked, which shows that there's an ultimate awareness of all these problems because of the complexities. Because at the end, they reconcile briefly in the bar just before he collapses, and but that really sad ending. They reconcile briefly, and she says, "You're your own person. I recognise my age, that kind of thing." And maybe, and in that respect, it's actually quite, that's one of the nicest. It's one of the most bittersweet kind of moments because you get these moments of, I don't know. It's more like the moments of communication, harmony, unity. When
Kind of.
two people are sort of getting on in that same way.
I think what I found, I don't know though, I found that moment kind of, I don't know, for me that moment almost felt like a power transfer. So I don't know about this, but for me it felt like in order to keep him, she had to kind of almost like,
Like disable him.
No, not really. Almost like, because obviously the fact that she's so much older than him is a big issue throughout the film. So in that scene where she goes, you can do what you want because I'm old, it felt like almost she was,
she was playing upon playing his sympathies or trying to play upon, be like, oh, forget me, blah, 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 and hoping he'd come back.
I don't even know. Almost like, sorry, I should have thought about this more
No.
before I started to articulate it. But it did feel like instead of saying we can have this relationship, despite the fact that you're an Algerian immigrant and I'm an older woman, and we don't need to care what the world thinks. She's saying, I don't know.
Well,
The world
I think
expects you to cheat on me because you're young and beautiful, so so I'm old. So
Yes.
I don't
Well, so
know.
you mean,
I don't know if I
there's
was
a feel-
reading
there's a
that
feels
wrong,
like
but
there's
it
just-
didn't feel like a moment of reconciliation
But
per
Well,
se,
no, there's
or
a bit-
flawed
I
reconciliation.
think more put like everyone
concession.
holds to some degree prejudices. I
Hmm.
think maybe that's what's
or she acquiesces. At that moment, there's a kind of she acquiesces to the social pressure surrounding her, and therefore she
Yeah.
gives in to stereotypes. I definitely
Yeah,
feel like she does.
that's-
I definitely she gives in to racial prejudice, and to a certain extent, because there's a bit where she that everything's fine. She's defensive, and she's always on the look. She's always calling people out, and then suddenly she can't really take it anymore. The relationship breaks down a bit. But then afterwards it isn't quite the same, and then you could say his collapse is there's something to be said about the fact that he has this collapse immediately after, and then he's subjugated again, or I find that, I don't know, there was something, considering the way, I don't know, the way, how much, the kind of symbolic or potentially metaphoric weight that people's actions and intent and kind of are given in the film. But that collapse and subjugation is something, and the Doctor's something a bit weird, isn't he? Like, I'll leave you alone, and you'll be big enough to make your own decisions, or something like that. Or is it one of those sort of comments? Like the Doctor says something strange and haunting at the end.
Yeah.
I do like quite one of you wrote in the notes that like Loachian kind of like you feel the structures. It's a film that really about agency versus structure, and in terms of like the structures of prejudice
And it's
in Germany.
And it's about how the
at that
world
time.
has sort of carried on without them,
Yeah,
nevertheless.
like,
And
I
that's
mean,
that's definitely
yeah.
a Loachian vibe.
The end, I mean, right down to the whole, him collapsing at this moment of like seeming triumph. That's like the same as I, Daniel Blake, except obviously in I, Daniel Blake he dies. Spoilers.
We'll just cut that bit out.
Yeah. And whereas in Felix the Soul he survives it, but still that both have a kind of haunting ending of like look at the situation our society is in. Like they both have a sort of sense of anger to them, I suppose.
Well, yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'd like to see more. This week I think I'm recommending to Molly and James, Private Road by Barney Platts Mills. So it's about kind of a young writer who attempts to assert artistic freedom while straddling a relationship with his kind of suburban, middle class girlfriend and this sort of bohemian lifestyle he maintains. It has a young Bruce Robinson in the leading role, and it's just under 20 years before you're with Now and I. And I wonder whether you guys will notice anything from that at all.
Ooh.
Okay, keep
Looking
an eye
forward
out.
to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent.
Great.
But on that, we must conclude the podcast.
Yeah.
So it's goodbye from me.
Essentially, before we go...
God.
No, it's fine. So on Sunday, our next screening, seeing as it's Halloween this week, will be on the theme of horror. So if you go to our Facebook page at York Movie Society, you will have a chance to vote for one of those films. And the winner will be announced on Friday. So see you at 7:30 in VO45 on Sunday for a good old horror film. And that's all from us this week.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.